Black Etc. podcast, a podcast about how ideas and culture spread among Black Americans, especially outside mass media. I'm your host, Ian Youssef. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Priscilla McCutcheon, who is an associate professor of geography at the University of Kentucky. She studies Black geographies, Black spirituality and religion, alternative food movements, and sustainable agriculture. We had a fantastic conversation about her work, the meaning of Black geographies, and how Black geographies are mediated through Black religious institutions, Black spiritual practices, and Black foodways and agriculture. We talked about various forms of resistance from a wide variety of Black women doing food work, feeding people. Dr. McCutcheon poured through the archives of Fannie Lou Hamer, so we talked about her work with the Freedom Farm Cooperative in Mississippi and how that work was supported, some might think surprisingly, by more conservative, mainstream, respectable, in quotes, organizations like the National Council of Negro Women. We got into a little bit about her research with supposedly radical Black religious organizations like the Nation of Islam, but also radical Black Christian organizations and churches. Dr. McCutcheon talked about the role that food plays in the Nation of Islam's work and outreach, and that got us into a broader discussion about the role of pork in Black communities and the complicated history and nature of the arguments for and against. So I dubbed it the Pork Wars, and so we talked a little bit about both of our experiences with the Pork Wars. And then finally we talked some about modern technology, social media and surveillance, and how that upsets or upends our idea of public discourse. Because you're dealing with large corporations, profit motive, individuals who are using these platforms to seek attention, not to actually talk to people. You're talking about bots and fake people, which is not good for discourse, understanding, any of that. I was really impressed with the breadth of Dr. McCutcheon's knowledge and work. She's extremely thoughtful, and I'm delighted that she agreed to have this discussion with me. Enjoy. Today I'm here with Dr. Priscilla McCutcheon, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Kentucky. She studies Black geographies and alternative food movements, sustainable agriculture, and spirituality and religion amongst Black folks. Welcome, Dr. McCutcheon. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Your dissertation, I believe, was called Heaven on Earth, Race, Food, and Space in Black Religious Food Programs.
Yes.
What drew you to studying the intersection of food, agriculture, and religion?
So I think there are two parts. They are personal and professional. And so the personal part, I will try to make fairly brief, but I grew up in a small rural town in South Carolina, Denmark, South Carolina, which is a majority Black town. My maternal grandparents worked with the land, and so they were farmers. My maternal grandfather was also a brick mason, and my maternal grandmother was a homemaker. My paternal grandparents also worked with food, and so they lived a little further away in a small town called Lake City, South Carolina, and they were restaurant owners, so they owned a small restaurant. And so I was around food from a really young age, but also around agriculture and on the land. And so I saw that with my grandparents. I also saw that with my parents. My dad was a minister. He's a retired minister. And my mother was an agricultural entomologist. And so she looked at sustainable growing practices. And so I was always around food, always around agriculture. With that being said, I never thought that this was where I would end up in life. And so I went to college. I went to Spelman College with the intention of being an environmental justice lawyer. But I quickly realized with the urging of professors that research was for me and the law was not for me. And so the graduate school in political science and took one geography class, did a little research with Black farmers. And when I did the research with Black farmers, I asked them one central question, which is, what draws you to do this work? What draws you to growing practices? And their main answer was that there is something else out there. And so that there is something driving these growing practices. And the something wasn't necessarily religious, but the something was always spiritual. And so they talked about like the environmental part of it. They talked about the food, but they also talked about the spiritual part that was often outside of organized religion. And so this is what drew me to studying this intersection of food, religion, and agriculture, especially in the U.S. South, but also location honestly really, really helped. I was at the University of Georgia for my graduate work, and a lot of this work was being done in the U.S. South. It was being done in Georgia. It was being done in South Carolina. The Nation of Islam's programs were in southern Georgia. The Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church's programs were right across the border in South Carolina. And there were some other programs that were happening, some Christian churches that I worked with in Atlanta, Georgia. So I had really easy access to actually work in a meaningful way with these programs. So that is the hopefully not too long answer of what drew me to this work.
No, that was great. What do you mean when you use the term Black geographies? And why is that concept central to your work?
So Black geographies, a lot of it comes through this concept of Catherine McKittrick, but also Clyde Woods. And a lot of people know Black geographies and the politics of place is kind of this central work, though Black geographies as a framework really begins before that. And when we think about Black geographies, we think about looking beyond normative ways to study place, but to also study space. And so we look beyond mapping, not just mapping quantitatively, but also look beyond mapping qualitatively, because there are other ways to think about how we as Black people diasporically engage with space and also engage with place. And so one way to think about it is in more of an abstract way, but also a grounded way, is one of the first chapters in Black Geographies and the Politics of Place, which is No One Knows the Mystery at the Bottom of the Ocean. And so Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods are talking about how the transatlantic slave trade actually changes the current of the ocean. And so they're talking about in an abstract way, but they're also talking about materially, so in a physical geography way, so how this actually changes the current of the ocean. And so often when people think about Black geographies, they think about it in an abstract way, and it is abstract. We're thinking about a different theoretical construction or a different theoretical orientation to space and place, but also in a very material way, how do people engage with space and place just differently to really broaden our normative understandings of space and place. I don't know if I explained that well, but this is how I understand it in my work.
Can you give me an example of that in practice, of what that looks like in the States, let's say, how Black folks engage with space and place that's different in a way that is not necessarily the same way that the mainstream would engage with space and place?
I think one way that I think about it is maybe spiritual engagements. And so that is kind of bringing my own work into it, which still may be a little abstract. But when we often think about the spirit, we think about it as abstract. We think about it as something we can't see. But materially, how do we see that changing on the land? Or how do we see that? Or how do we see people using the spirit or spirituality to make changes on the land or the actual landscape?
What about Black religious spaces, and I guess spiritual engagements, make them effective sites of community and resistance, particularly the ones that are posed as radical, that I think you describe as more reflective of mainstream Black culture?
So one of the things that makes them effective sites of resistance, I think some of it has to do with Black people in general having really high percentages of religious affiliation, especially in the United States. And so the ones that are deemed as radical, I complicate a little. And so some of the groups that I study, like the Nation of Islam, and the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, a part of it is that they're being used for multiple roles. And so they are religious spaces. They're being used for spiritual practices. But the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, for example, is also a bookstore. And so Detroit would be a really good example. They also have a bookstore in Atlanta. In Georgia, the farms I studied, they have a chapel on the farms, but they're also engaging in farming practices. And so I think one of the things that makes them really radical sites of resistance is that you don't have to be a part of their religious practices or their spiritual practices to go to these sites. You can go to these sites and you can pick up a book that is about, Black liberation theology or about Black nationalism. And you can not necessarily believe in what the shrine is doing or what the Nation of Islam is doing. And so I think that's one of the things. Something else that I would add is that even groups that on their face seem mainstream. And so one of the organizations that I worked with was a Black Baptist church in Atlanta, Georgia. It is a mainstream church on its face, but it's also doing, I think, radical work, radical feeding work in Atlanta, Georgia, on Auburn Avenue, in a space where, quite frankly, a lot of the government doesn't necessarily want to see homeless people. And so radical, I think, means one thing to some people, but radical work could be feeding people every day and making visible people that the public, or in some cases government, doesn't necessarily want to be seen.
Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit about the Nation of Islam. What role does food play, aside from what you just mentioned, in the Nation of Islam's outreach and cultural project? So I think about like the bakeries and the bean pies that are associated with them that I bought from them growing up. Yeah, so what role does food play in their outreach?
Yeah, and so the bakeries and bean pies would be the first thing that I would go to. I think growing up in a rural area, it was honestly not what I saw initially, but going to college in Atlanta is one of the first things that I saw, the bakeries and bean pies. I think in their origin story, though, one of the things that Elijah Muhammad points to is going around to houses in the city and seeing what he points to Black Christians eating and saying that this is food that is not good for you. And so he's looking at foods like pork, for example, like catfish, foods that he says are not meaningful to the Black body, and saying that this is not food that is helpful to building a Black nation. And so at that time, he is using that to connect it to religious practices and bringing people into the Nation of Islam. In another way, when you look at their religious doctrine, and so I always point people to How to Eat, How to Live. I think there are 3 different versions, and so there's version 1, there's version 2, there's version 3, and they're very publicly available. They talk about food practices. They also point to growing practices, and they talk very specifically about what certain foods. And so I always point to foods that some people would say are a part of a typical soul food diet that they say are not necessarily good. And they talk about the preparation of those foods, but they say why they believe they're not good. And so they connect them to oppression, for example. Another example that I would give in popular culture, as I'm getting older, I realize that this example might not resonate with people, but if people have seen the Malcolm X movie, and so this movie that I'm talking about is the one with Denzel Washington. I think Angela Bassett plays Betty Shabazz. And the first question that Betty Shabazz asks Malcolm X when they're courting is, what are you eating? Because that's what she's concerned about. She's a nurse. She's also a nutritionist. So in their doctrine, eating, cleansing the Black body first is very important to how they see building a Black nation, because they don't think a nation can be healthy if individuals themselves are not healthy. I'll also say that one of the reasons, like if you look at How to Eat, How to Live, version 1, 2, and 3, that a lot of the foods that they mentioned are what a lot of people see as a part of a typical soul food diet or a Southern diet, is because a lot of nation members are from the South.
Yeah.
And so they're talking about foods that they grew up eating.
I do find this tension, especially the tension around pork and the pig, in traditional Black Christian and like Nation of Islam or even non-religious radical Black ideologies and spaces. So that tension between the pig being a center, a staple, and then the pig being verboten and like negative and all that. So that tension is fascinating to me. On the other side, you've done work on Fannie Lou Hamer, her work in Mississippi, founding the Freedom Farm Cooperative, which included pig banks, for example. Can you talk a little bit about her work?
Yeah, I can. And so I appreciate you bringing up that tension because it's something that I struggle with personally, especially doing the type of work that I do. And I always want to present to people when I talk about pork, particularly that people's views evolve over the years. And I think the preparation is what a lot of people focus on. And there were Black power groups during that time who were doing work that included building a Black nation and Black civil rights groups that did not necessarily reject foods like pork, for example. And so Fannie Lou Hamer is a really good example. Some people would classify her as a civil rights activist. Some people would classify her as a Black power activist. I would classify her as both. I would say she didn't really care about her classification. She was just doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And a part of her work was anti-poverty work and feeding people because she didn't believe that people could actually get out to vote and do voting rights work if they were also hungry at the same time. And so Fannie Lou Hamer establishes Freedom Farms or Freedom Farms Cooperative in Mississippi. And this is anti-poverty work. And a big part of it is housing. A big part of it is growing sustainable food. But a big part of it is also the pig bank. The pig bank is fascinating to me because if people know anything about raising pigs or people know anything about growing pigs, one pig can feed, if you process it and break it down, depending on how large the pig is, can feed a family of four for a year if it's preserved correctly. And so one pig goes a long way, and then that one pig might produce other pigs or is sometimes used to breed other pigs. And so the pig bank was funded by the National Council of Negro Women as a part of their programming. And this is a part of what made this program so sustainable and what helped to feed a lot of people. And so these pigs were sustainable, which probably sounds weird to say, but they were raised sustainably. I don't exactly know much about their processing, but this was again a way to feed quite a bit of people. She did this with very few volunteers. She paid some staff, and so it was a large operation in terms of the number of people. I don't know the exact number that were fed, but it was small in terms of the number of people who actually funded the farming cooperative. Something else that I think is important about Fannie Lou Hamer's work on the farming cooperative is that she did not make people buy into the farming cooperative. When people hear farming cooperative, especially now, they think about something that you buy into or you buy into with your labor. So either capital or labor. During this time, she's working with a population of people who did not have capital. And so she's often providing their first house and she's providing a service, and she knows that they don't necessarily have the means to be able to buy into it. And so in some cases, the Freedom Farming Cooperative struggled financially, but one of the reasons is because people didn't have to buy into it. Mm-hmm. She got quite a few donations for this farming cooperative. And so people who had no experience with Mississippi, people who had no experience with really the South for that matter, contributed heavily. When I was looking through the archives, one of the major contributors to Freedom Farming Cooperatives was Harry Belafonte. Mm-hmm. And so she had really famous people give large amounts of money. She also had people send like $1 saying, I want to do everything that I can to make sure that this is sustainable. And so I think her model provides a model for farming cooperatives afterwards. And I think if you look at like her speeches and her public testimonies, even the one in front of the Democratic National Convention, she always goes back to the same speech and the same story, which I think is true, which is that people can't do political work if they don't have the means or material means to be fed.
In what ways did the National Council of Negro Women and other Black women's groups of the early to mid-20th century spread practices and ideas about Black women's power, racial uplift, and the like?
So the National Council of Negro Women and other organizations like them, but particularly the National Council of Negro Women, had a very strong message of self-help and racial uplift that some people agreed with and some people did not. The National Council of Negro Women, founded by Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, and a lot of people know Dorothy Heider. Dr. Dorothy Heider is another famous leader of the National Council of Negro Women, was an organization of organizations. And so they had chapters, but they also included other powerful Black organizations. And so all of the historically Black sororities were a part of the National Council of Negro Women. They believed that if they combined their powers, that they could be politically active and that they could help the conditions of people across the country and in some cases across the world. And so they believed in working within the system. And so they were involved in major presidential administrations like the Roosevelt administrations, but they also worked outside of the system. Some of their work outside of the system was known. Some of their work outside of the system was not as known. And so their work, for example, with Fannie Lou Hamer, people knew about it, but people did not know as much about it until later on going through the archives, as much as their political work within the system with like presidential administrations. They held a hunger convention in the 1970s where they brought together policy leaders to talk about the conditions affecting Black kids and hunger in the nation. And so with the hunger convention, they weren't just talking about people being hungry. They were also talking about mental health. It was incredibly comprehensive. I would say for the 2000s, much less 1970 something. So a part of the way that they were doing this work was on multiple scales. They were doing it within government, but they were also going to the geographical site. And so in this case, if we go back to Fannie Lou Hamer, they were going to Mississippi. They had a program called Wednesdays in Mississippi's, and so WIMS, where they would go down to send women down to Mississippi. They were heavily trained, and so they would send Black women down to Mississippi. These Black women were tasked with working with white women for different types of programs. So hunger programs, other programs for employment to help the conditions of people in the area. And so a lot of people would argue that groups like the National Council of Negro Women use respectability politics as a tactic. And I would agree with that to a point. But I do think that the tactic part is important. They were using it as a political way for a change to happen. And again, they work within the system and out of the system. Trying to think of other things that come up about the National Council of Negro Women. Again, with the archives, when you look through Fannie Lou Hamer's archives, the major funding sources of her pig banks were the National Council of Negro Women. So they understood the meaning of hunger, and they understood that to feed people, that this was a really good way to provide a sustainable food source.
Yeah. So again, the tension in pork is really fascinating to me because it encompasses a lot of religion, as we talked about, Christian and Muslim, class, geography, like southern, northern, urban, rural, educated, not educated, all of that. And it's kind of all in this weird mixed up jumble. In my experience, so my folks are from the South. We always ate pork. Once I got to college, I encountered a lot of the anti-pork stuff, and especially I was getting it through rap music, right? So like the 5%er Muslim rappers or rappers who at least adopted the food content or the food relationship from the Nation of Islam, etc. So I never had the kind of anti-pork thing that a lot of people in my similar station had who either didn't have family from the South or who maybe had other cultural influences. I'm curious about your personal experience with the pork wars.
I like the term the pork wars, which is an interesting term. I grew up I've seen pork being processed.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen a lot of things being processed. And so I think when you see something being processed, you know when it's good and you know when it's bad. And I realized that that can be the case for any type of meat. And so my personal experience growing up was that I should know where my food came from, and that should be the case for pork, that should be the case for chicken, that should be the case for beef. I did understand that based on religion, people had different orientations toward pork. And I always understood that I should respect that some people eat pork and some people do not. And so I knew from a very early age that, particularly when I went outside of my small town, that I would encounter people who did not eat pork. We grew up around pork, but we also grew up fairly close to the coast. And so we grew up around a lot of seafood. And so pork was an addition, but it was not like it was never the main source of food in my house. I will also say that like my personal orientation was I grew up knowing what I thought to be the historical significance of pork, especially in the South, or especially where I was from, which is that people ate pork. Like there were some parts of pork that we ate when we didn't have anything else to eat. And so there were some times, particularly holidays, New Year's would be a really good example. Like there are some parts of pork that I eat on New Year's. Fatback, I'm certain there's a technical term for that, hog jowl, that I never eat any other time of the year. And so that is more to honor history, which I see as a good thing. And so I grew up with kind of historical, orientation towards pork, but I also grew up wanting to know where it came from, which was the case with all of my meats, and really respecting that there was kind of a religious, or not kind of, but there's a religious orientation for some people where eating pork is wrong. And I respect that. In terms of whether or not pork or whether or not any meat is clean or not, particularly going to school in Georgia, we were fairly close to chicken factories, for example. And it's not to switch the conversation away from pork, but I grew up kind of knowing that a lot of meat is raised in conditions that are unsafe and unclean, and that's not just pigs. And so I was always, and I'm still always very concerned with where any of my food, but particularly my meat, comes from and the kind of conditions that it's raised in. And so the pork wars are interesting, and I do find it interesting when it's connected to health, which I think is important. There are other ways to look at meat and health that is not just about pork, even though, again, the religious part I respect.
So a couple things that what you said kind of made me think of. One, about the processing, right? So like, let's say my father grew up in part on a farm, seeing the animals processed too. His response was he still ate pork until his later years. My wife's mother also grew up seeing pigs processed near Houston in Texas. She's like the opposite. She's been a pescatarian for the longest because of that, I think, seeing it close up. And two, there's a specific class thing that I also find interesting that we haven't spoken about yet, which is cultural identity.
Mm-hmm.
One's relationship to pork being kind of a cultural marker, a marker of, quote, consciousness or respectability. And in some instances, as I get more into like the food world, right, the dining restaurant world, of class and sophistication. So for instance, a lot of the high-end places, they embrace offal, right? They embrace all the other meat that's considered weird and different, just like poor people, right? In their sense, I think they're trying to distance themselves from middle-class respectability, who in turn are trying to distance themselves from poverty by rejecting chitlins and ears and tails and all that kind of stuff, right? So I kind of find it interesting as a class marker and a marker of respectability as well, the pork thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have a lot that I could say about that. The restaurant world is interesting, particularly like the types of restaurants and the farm to table movement and making things $40 or $50 a plate that used to not be seen as acceptable to eat, or is still not acceptable to eat. And so Kentucky would be a good example. in some cases we're talking about Black foodways, but in this case we're talking about foraging, which was done by white Appalachian people. And now foraging and a lot of what is foraged is being sold in restaurants for high prices, but people who foraged in the early days were not necessarily seen in positive lights.
Yeah.
And especially like coming from the South, foods that I grew up loving and going to a larger city and sometimes saying it around classmates from larger cities. And they would say, "You eat what and why?" And like that being associated with being country.
Right.
And what that actually means in terms of like a class marker.
Yeah. Since you mentioned Appalachia, you talk about Kentucky, right? Do you have any experience with pawpaw fruit?
I don't. And so I am not I respect pawpaw as a fruit. My husband loves pawpaw. He is Afro-Puerto Rican, so he talks about it as a mixture of mangoes and bananas. That's how he describes the taste. I don't love the texture, but I respect it as, a fruit that people in Kentucky really love.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that. That's accurate. It has a little weird fermented kind of taste to it that takes some getting used to, I guess.
Yes.
In your work, you talk a lot about the public and counterpublic, which is a common frame in Black critical work. How do you think modern technology, social media, and surveillance complicate the public counterpublic vision?
I think that's a good question. I would start from the end, the surveillance part, which is I think we're always being watched in some ways, which is what I tell myself and my students. I think in general, the opening up the public or discourse online and to more people is generally a good thing, but barriers still exist to this public discourse online. And so I still draw from being from a rural area. And even though Lexington, where I am now, is not rural, but being near rural areas and knowing that sometimes technology, particularly the internet, is not equally accessible to everyone. And so we don't all have access to this public discourse. And even when we do have access to it, we don't always know who we're interacting with. And so when I think about interacting with the public in an online space, like who am I engaging with? Am I engaging with a bot? Is this a real person? And then being a geographer, I'm concerned with where this person is. And so like, where is our public? When I think about the counterpublic or the public square, like in this very basic way, the public square was a place that you could actually go. Mm-hmm. The public square was a place that you could actually talk to people. But if online is our public square, like geographically, how are we actually gathering? How can we talk to people? And so I think a lot about my students who are growing up online and who went through this whole process of COVID when they were not around people. And a lot of them will admittedly say they don't actually know how to talk to people. It's really hard for them to engage with people. And so the question of like, how does modern technology complicate the vision of public discourse? I think in general, there are good and bad sides to technology. I think it should be regulated, like governmentally regulated in some ways. I don't mean surveilled, but regulated. And I think we should know, like have more of a knowledge of who's actually online. And so the whole process of a bot, and it could be an age thing, but not actually talking to a real person scares me. And so knowing that I'm not talking to someone who's actually engaging with me on a human level, to me is a scary thing. With that being said, there are certain parts of the public discourse. And so when I think about the development of Black ecologies, for example, as a field of thought, a lot of it is developing during the pandemic, and it's developing online with the work of like J.T. Rowan and Justin Hosby. And without this online space, and it's developing as a worldwide movement, it would be really hard for it to develop without this online space. And so I think there are good and bad sides to it, but I do like to see the public and I like to know where the public is. And I think that we should be able to talk to each other face to face at some point.
Yeah, well said. How have attacks on Black culture and history affected your work?
Also a hard question. They've affected in multiple ways. Again, like going back to the geographer, I think about scales. And so there's the world, there's the national scale, the state level, and then the local scale. And then all of these are interconnected. And so I think that in Kentucky, for example, there's legislation, I think House Bill 4, that broadly attacks anything that's labeled diversity, equity, inclusion. And so that would be the work that I do. And then there's also, again, not just rhetoric that's coming from the national scale, but actually policies that's coming from the national scale. And so there's legislation that's happening. Departments are being closed. I'm in a geography department, but I'm also in a Black Studies department that is still open with amazing colleagues. But the threat does not mean that the work is not being done. It's still being done at the community level and also at the institutional level. And students still want to learn. And so I have found on a personal scale that my classes where I teach about race and social justice, particularly through food, are still busting at the seams. My evaluations in those classes in Kentucky are still really high, and most of my students don't look like me. And students want to know this information. And I've also found that graduate students still want to study this stuff. And so I find that the students are still interested in all of these issues. Researchers are still doing amazing work. Funding is an issue at the national level, particularly governmental funding. And so like NSF, NIH, NEH funding, but some foundations are stepping up and also providing funding. And so I think particularly when I look at like the history of Black studies, the work will always get done. The work has always been under attack. It is particularly under attack now. But I am heartened when I know that students, again, who have no real grounding in Black studies when they come to University of Kentucky, they want to know this information. They want to know about the issues that are affecting them. And some, they don't even know what's affecting them. And so I am heartened when I go into the classroom. And for me, that is what keeps me going. The research in the community also keep me going.
Mm-hmm. So what are you currently working on?
So I am working on a book project that is keeping me going, but also keeping me up about food and agriculture in rural inland South Carolina. And so I'm looking at the importance of small Black churches in rural inland South Carolina and them as placemaking apparatuses from their founding, or so starting as brush harbors, so as impermanent structures during enslavement, to their current functions now. But I'm also looking at Black spirituality in this book more broadly in South Carolina. And so when I say Black spirituality more broadly, medicine women, the importance of Black herbalists in rural South Carolina and how these are also spiritual practices. And so that is what I'm currently working on with my book project.
All right. Now we get to the set of questions that I ask every guest.
Okay.
The first one. What songs got people on the dance floor when you were going out dancing? Or what songs still get people on the dance floor to this day?
Well, Knuck If You Buck cleared the dance floor when I was in college. So I would say that. Trying to think, I was a two-stepper in college, so I was on the peripheries of the dance floor.
Okay.
Anything like 69 Boys got people on the dance floor.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the second question?
What still gets them on the floor?
The same.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, we're generally from the same era. What is a Black cultural work that's a classic but is underappreciated in your eyes? Any genre, any medium.
Oh, that's a good question. Underappreciated. The one that I'm thinking about is not underappreciated, but it is still incredibly important to me. And so I would say Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Are Watching God. And the reason that I say that, the part that I think is underappreciated is Zora Neale Hurston using dialect that is familiar to me and familiar, I think, to a lot of people in the South and the rural South. And that dialect being known and being seen in academic spaces.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, what particular dish did your family make that you looked forward to the most?
Turkey necks.
Mm.
Stewed turkey necks with onions over rice is what I would like my father to make for me when I go home.
Yeah. Lovely. All right, Dr. Priscilla McCutcheon, where can folks find you online?
They can find me online at uky.edu in the geography department, and that is my official university website. I'm still working on building a personal one, but that is my official website.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that we can do it again.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Take care.
I want to thank Dr. Priscilla McCutcheon once again for an enlightening discussion. She's working on her personal website, but you can find her at the University of Kentucky's website on the geography page. She should be on the faculty page there. In terms of lessons, my discussion with Dr. McCutcheon made me reflect on the singular nature, the uniqueness of Black political, ideological, and cultural identity, and how that manifests in our work and thought. So one, when we were speaking about Fannie Lou Hamer's radical work trying to feed folks in Mississippi during the Jim Crow era with the Freedom Farm Cooperative, the notion that someone should find ways to feed these poor disenfranchised people is in many ways radical. That idea would later inspire folks like the Black Panthers with their free breakfast program. But even in Fannie Lou Hamer's time, Miss Hamer's own work, as Dr. McCutcheon mentioned, was being funded in a lot of ways by the National Council of Negro Women, who were decidedly more mainstream and conservative. And then they also worked on hunger programs. So this idea of the centrality and the importance of feeding Black impoverished children, that transcended not only time, but political ideology. No matter how different these people were in approach and presentation, they shared the basic idea of the necessity of feeding poor people, especially poor children. Which gets me to my point that Black ideology and practice does not map easily on the mainstream American ideological axis. Black political ideology is a mix of liberal, conservative, practical, radical, progressive, all of that. It is not abstract. It's rooted primarily in material reality and outcomes, which is in part why large numbers of Black people vote the same, even though they have huge ideological differences. Because it's not based on ideology, it's based on material reality and resources. And that underlying reality is kind of the same for a good deal of us, despite our many differences. So that lesson, the uniqueness of Black American situation, is also reflected in our discussion about pork and the pro and anti-pork wars in the Black community here. There is no clean line. It's not just Muslims versus Christians. It's not just poor versus rich or urban versus rural or educated versus non-educated. There are tons of levers and overlapping and interlocking influences that determine whether somebody not only eats pork, but is vocal about eating or not eating pork. So I think that really truly reflects the singular nature of Black cultural reality here, is that there's so many overlapping influences and you can't really make sense of it independent of our history. And then finally, a lesson I took away from the discussion is when Dr. McCutcheon speaks about her skepticism and resistance and wariness of the online social media world when people are trying to present social media as the new public square. She rightly points out how everybody doesn't have access to this. Rural people don't have access to internet. A lot of impoverished people don't have access to the same extent. But also, older people are not on it as much as younger people. Some people just are too busy. Some people have no interest in what's going on there. So social media is not actually the town square. It's also complicated by the fact that there are tons of bots, because the point isn't to have discussions. The point is to keep people there. And you keep people there by outraging them, giving them what they want or what they don't want, just to keep activity. There's also the issue of individuals wanting to monetize or get attention from social media. So all of these competing influences make it so that social media is not actually an approximation of the public town square where people can come together to talk about ideas. There are too many negative incentives, profit, attention, outrage. All of these things run roughshod over the idea of social media as community and as site for public discourse. So my lesson is, I agree with Dr. McCutcheon. Even though there are great things about social media in the online space that help connect us, it's not a proxy for the public sphere. It's not the ideal site for public discourse, which really reflects some of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, because I'm trying to talk about how ideas spread outside of mass media and social media, because I think that is where the true community lies. I really do hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, please like, rate, review, share on whatever platform you use to listen. Visit the website, blacketcpod.com. Until next time.